Right, I'll start with one of my little analogies. And my regular viewers are probably bored with my analogies because, you know, what we all do when we make videos, we talk about experiences we've had. So most of my experiences are either about being a postman or a policeman or a prison officer. So, so I'll start with a little analogy. When I joined the post office in 2004, there was this postman called Chris, and his nickname was Ginge, and he said to me, "You will get bitten by a dog." And he said the reason is the dog has a problem with the postman because the postman comes but doesn't go in the house. So he said you will get bitten by a dog. And I was like, oh God, I suppose that'll hurt. And then all of 2005 went by, and then most of 2006, and I didn't get bitten because I was careful, and if there was a big dog loose, I'd ring up, I'd call out, I'd beat my horn, I wouldn't go in, and I'd be alert. And I thought, oh, maybe I'm an exception to the rule. And then one day, I can still remember the house is Dangina on Grays Road, and there was this farm-like gate with like sort of wooden slats, and there was a box by the gate, and there was these two vicious Alsatians in there, and there was this old lady lived in there. Obviously, because the box was by the gate, you didn't normally have to go in at all. But on this particular day, I had a recorded delivery that needed signing. So I beat my horn, and the old lady came out, and she was just signing the thing over the gate. And these two vicious Alsatians, they were going mad behind this gate. And I was like, well, I'm fine. They're behind the gate, I'm out here. And obviously, if the Alsatian put its head like that, it didn't go through the gate because the gaps in the wood weren't big enough. Then suddenly it was, ah! And I look, and one of these bastard dogs, it actually turned its head because it was so desperate to bite a postman. It turned its head and put his neck through this farm gate, and it bit. I had shorts on, so it bit me right on the flesh. And this wasn't like, I mean, I've been bit since by these little rat-like dogs, and you hardly even notice it. But if you're bitten by an Alsatian, particularly on your bare skin, you notice it. And oh God, it was a shock. Now, the reason I'm telling you this tiresome analogy is I knew that was a possibility. I knew that was probably coming. But when it came, it was still a shock. And I think this explains a lot of what we've seen about the Queen. I mean, a 96-year-old woman, we all knew sooner or later she was going to die. But obviously, it was a big shock for many people when she did. And in this video, I want to look at the Queen and her legacy and why there has been so much of a reaction to it. And I think it tells us some facts that us in the movement, we can draw knowledge from and draw experience from. Now, first of all, why this massive outpouring of grief? I mean, you see my little poster there from the Daily Mail on Tuesday, the day after her funeral. I mean, the Daily Mail, I got it from Puerto del Carmen. The Daily Mail Tuesday, you had to go all the way through it, right to the middle, before you got a story that wasn't just Queen, Queen, Queen. And but they're obviously a commercial enterprise, so they wouldn't be doing that if there wasn't a market for it. So, and obviously there's thousands of people on the mall lining the route. Well, millions even. Now, part of this, I think, is that it reminds the Queen, because she's always been there. I mean, I was born in 1978, so she was already 52 by the time I was born. But she's always been there. And I think what people feel about the Queen, the reason they've got this grief, the reason they're so upset is she reminds them of more secure, more certain times. I mean, I'll just give you a bit of my background. I mean, my family, my uncles, aunties, grandparents, they were sort of East End type, working class type people who, like a lot of families, they moved out of London. I mean, some went to Essex, but my family went out towards Kent and, Biggin Hill, and my uncle and auntie were in Penge, and it reminds you. And I just show. I mean, this is my grandpop and nanny. That's in the. He died in '93. She died in 2009. This is Uncle Les and Auntie Jack, and her real name was Kathleen, but she was called Jack because when she was a little baby, she apparently put up her fists, and when she was born in 1913, there was a boxer who was called Jack something, so that's why she was always called Jack, and that's me as a youngster with my mum and dad, all now sadly gone. And what the Queen is, a lot of people like me, the Queen will be tied to Christmases with people who are now dead. So she's a link with the past, a link with the childhood. I mean, a link when I had a big family, and it wasn't just me and my uncle in England, my uncle Alan in England, and my brother and his Chinese wife. So it reminds you of that time when you had a massive big family, and we'd all, obviously Christmas. I mean, millions of families would be like this. We'd all sit down and have dinner on Christmas Day. I remember Uncle Les, for some reason, he'd always sit on a hard chair all day. He'd never sit in an armchair or a sofa. He'd always sit on a hard chair, you know. And my grandpa might talk about his time in the RAF in the war. And obviously in the 80s and 90s, TV was a much bigger thing. And, when you were at school, everyone would talk about what was on telly the night before. And if you hadn't watched this program, you might be the odd one out with your classmates. It's not like today, where any given evening, children might be watching 100 different things online or satellite TV. It would be those four channels, and Channel 5 didn't even come in till I was like a sixth former, I don't think. And TV was the big thing. Now, Christmas Day, my mum was quite strict. There was some kids, Christmas Day morning before the dinner was served, they were allowed to go upstairs and watch cartoons. But my mum, bless her, she was strict. She was old school. Now, so the only time during those Christmases in the 80s and early 90s, the only time our TV was turned on was at 3 o'clock for the Queen's speech after dinner. That's the only time we saw TV on a Christmas Day in the 80s and early 90s. And all these people, all these sort of working class people who'd moved out of London and come to live in sort of more suburban countryside areas. I mean, Biggin Hill, sort of countryside suburban area. That they'd never met the Queen. She probably had nothing in common with them. Totally different interests, outlooks. But for them, the Queen, it was tied to their sense of Britishness, their sense of patriotism, their sense of constancy. And you read this in Tuesday's Daily Mail as well. They've picked up on this because they've said in a lot of the articles it's about the Queen was tied to their sense of being British. And you've got to remember the 80s and the early 90s, it was a very different time. I mean, you had, I mean, there obviously were ethnic minority people, but it was a side issue. And to those people who are now dead in those photos, the idea of an ethnic minority chancellor, or parts of laws on what you can and can't say, and being arrested for saying stuff on Twitter, I mean, it would be unbelievable to them. And also there things like the LGBT agenda. I mean, it was a sort of a side issue. I mean, in the 80s you had Kenneth Williams, who seemed a very nice guy and a man of quite big talent. Now, most people realised he was probably gay, but he didn't sort of feel the need to use it as an identity of some sort of victim identity, or suppress anyone's right to say the word puff, or he didn't sort of feel any need to wear a little badge with a rainbow on or wave a flag. And what you've got to remember is all this stuff, it's very, very recent. All this woke stuff that really is ratcheting up upon us in the movement, it really is quite recent phenomenon. I mean, when I was doing my A-levels, I kept a diary. This was about 1996, 97. And then one of the things I wrote on it, it really struck me. And it was in the library doing some work, and one of the lecturers, Dell, he came up to me, and I think William Hague had just been made Tory leader. And this Dell, he wasn't some right winger. He was a fanatical lefty, hated Tories and all the rest of it. And he came up to me in the library, because back then I was a sort of young Tory boy with my little pal Adrian. And he made jokes about, oh, your leader Hague, William Hague, he's a secret gay. And he was making a joke of it. Yeah, your Hague, he's really a gay. Now, you imagine that now in a sixth form college, a left-wing teacher going up joking about a politician being gay, because the little woke student had turned around and say, well, what if he's gay? He should be very proud to be gay. Are you saying it's wrong? Do I need to report you to HR? This is the sort of world we live in now. And this idea that this was the world of the 80s and 90s, the certainty, and you could make an offhanded comment, and without necessarily wishing to offend anyone, but you wouldn't have some little Puritan PC guy pull you up on it. Now we're going to anecdote 2. So here's just a little anecdote. I was in a police van with some other police officers one night shift, and we were going up Edgware Road. And there was a car, a sports car, went along the side of the van. And someone noticed it, and they thought it was a flashy car. And they just said to me, Gus, who's in that van? Who's in that car? Is it old people, young people? Who are they? Do they look sus? And I just looked over, and I said, oh, it's Arab boys. They look a bit flashy, but they don't look suspicious. And then suddenly, there's this little prick in the van called Charlie Charles, and he gives me a lecture on PC. Don't use the word boy to refer to those Arab young men. That's colonial language. And this sort of lecture, it went on for about 3 or 4 minutes. And obviously I was at work. I'd have loved to add a row back. But then you think, well, if we have a big row and he takes this further, no one in that van's going to defend me. They're all going to say, sit on the fence, or maybe even take his side, because that's a fashionable thing to do. And so I just stayed silent. And the thing is, I hadn't been trying to be offensive. I mean, I was about 38, 39 at the time, and you see young lads of 18, 19, they look, you sort of say, boys. I mean, maybe if they were white, I would have said white lads, but I wasn't trying to be offensive. It just rolled off the tongue. But that is the world we live in now, where you can say something without setting out to be offensive, and you get pulled up and held up as an example, and you got to correct your language. And that world back in the 80s, it wasn't like that. People could say stuff, and you know, and they weren't being called out. They didn't have to self-censor themselves. And so it was a time of certainty, a time of security. I mean, Dr. Dutton says in his videos about people don't say anymore in England, this is a free country. And that's why, because people know subconsciously it's not free. You can't say this, you can't say that. And it's not about setting out to bully someone or insult someone, because most of us, if someone isn't rude to us, we don't want to be rude or upset them. It's about this idea that your whole speech is censored. And the thing is, this is my issue with the Queen. I think this is, I mean, what I've put in the title of this video, she was very much like the boomers. I mean, I've said on my last video about the boomer generation and how they had the job security, the job opportunities, the home ownership, all these things they had, these comfortable lives, and so they pretend race was a side issue, and they thought it would never come to affect them. And there was this challenge to that Britain of the 80s, that traditional, patriotic, homogeneous society. There was that challenge coming over the horizon. The cultural Marxism, the LGBT fanatics, the ever more increased third world immigration, the demographic change. It was all coming gradually over the horizon. And the Queen, she was like the boomers. Because she had a comfortable life, she looked the other way. She failed to challenge it. And you think about the Britain that she took over, and how, what a brilliant country it was, and the Britain that she died in, and it's just gone from there to, you know, right downhill. And she never said a single word. And I mean, part of what the boomers did. I mean, I've written another analogy here about the 90s, early 90s, and free speech. There was a Jimmy Young show I was listening to, and this was about 2002, and there was some woke liberal on there, and he said to Jimmy Young, he said, what if, because someone was saying, oh, the royal family's out of touch because it's white, it's upper class, and this woke liberal said to Jimmy Young, oh, what if Prince William marries a black woman? And Jimmy Young came straight back and he said, I'd like to be a fly on the wall in the room where Prince William told Prince Philip he was going to marry a black woman. And these, I mean, now he'd probably lose his job for saying that, you know. So, and this was the world we had. And what the boomers did, they were very much like this newspaper. These changes that were coming, they saw them and they moaned about them. But whenever someone came out, like the National Front, like the BNP, and said, look, here's a solution, here's the way to stop all this, they sort of backed away and got scared. And I mean, my mum was very much the boomer, bless her. And obviously, I've said to you on here before about my political involvement. I started out in the Tories in the 90s. I left, for more right-wing organisations, the Conservative Democratic Alliance, the Monday Club, the BNP, UKIP, Swinton Circle. And my mum, when I was involved with the BNP, she wasn't keen on it. I mean, I tried to persuade, my dad probably would have gone with me. I tried to persuade my mum and dad, come along to a BNP meeting with me. And my mum she wouldn't have it. And because what she believed the nonsense that was in this paper, that the BNP were all thugs and football hooligans and criminals. And that was the typical boomer mentality. I mean, I remember 2004, Nick got really close to getting into the European Parliament. But the weekend before the vote, they had a slur article in the Daily Mail saying all this stuff about Nazis. And that's probably why he just missed it. All these middle class or upper working class boomers, they backed away. They got scared. And another time, this was later on, I think this was about 2007, 8. There was this lady called Rowena who was in the BNP, and she was dropping off some leaflets at my house. And I said to my mum, I said, oh, there's a lady from the BNP, she's going to drop some leaflets off. I said, can I just bring her in, have a coffee? And she got, I'm not having some BNP fanatic in my house. And it wasn't because my mum was a left-winger. She was just a normie boomer. I mean, she voted Tory. I mean, she was a normie boomer who believed all the lies in her Daily Mail. And so this poor Rowena woman, I remember at one I had to go out and I met her on the doorstep. And thankfully, she didn't sort of ask to come in or expect to come in. But I was a bit embarrassed because there's a party comrade kind enough to drop off some leaflets round my house, and I can't invite her in for a cup of tea or anything. And part of this, we say with the Queen and the boomers, that they had all this comfort. Part of our criticism, the younger people who are dealing with the situation they've left us because of their neglect, a lot of us start saying, oh, they were selfish because they had free speech at their college, university, because they had job security, because they didn't have positive discrimination working against them, because they had home ownership, because the country hadn't been flooded with third world immigrants, there were 10 people chasing every house. Because they had all this, they ignored the problems, and we say, oh, it's selfish. But I don't know, with the Queen and with the boomers, we can even be that harsh, because human beings have got this tendency to think that if things have always been comfortable and secure, they're going to stay that way. I mean, you've probably seen on the news, we're exactly a year away, more or less, from the volcano that erupted on the neighbouring island of La Palma. The neighbouring Canary Island, there's 7 Canary Islands, and it's the one furthest to the west, sorry. I live here and I don't know the geography. So this volcano erupted, and I watch Spanish news to improve my Spanish, and there was this woman said to a guy, I think it was, he said to a reporter, he said, oh, that volcano erupted, and my whole life was like rubbed out with a rubber. I lost everything, every possession I had, all my paperwork, all my passport, everything. Now, that guy, he lived near an active volcano, and that volcano had erupted in 1971. But he assumed it's not going to erupt again for 200 years. And so he didn't have like a pack of or a plan of what to do if the volcano suddenly erupted. He didn't have like a suitcase in the corner. He didn't know straight away, oh, my passport's over there, my laptop's out. So he wasn't able to, gather all the stuff from his house in 5 minutes. Now you'd think, oh, a person living near a volcano, they'd think, oh, they'd have a little plan for if the volcano erupted. But he didn't. And this is the tendency that humans have got. Because things are comfortable, things are good, they think it's always going to stay that way. And so in a sense it's a bit harsh of me to be going on about the boomers, like my late mum and dad, and millions of others like the Queen, and say they were just selfish. It might not have just been selfishness that they ignored all these problems. It might have been that complacency that we all have, that we think, oh, it's always been fine. That volcano hasn't erupted since 1971. On average, it goes off every 150, 200 years. I'll be dead time it goes off, Nick. See, that is the complacency that humans have, because humans, I mean, we like to be optimists. We don't like to give ourselves stress and depression, thinking constantly about the worst case scenario. So this is probably what the Queen and the boomers did. There were these problems coming over the horizon, and they ignored them because they thought, oh, it's not that big a problem. Multiculturalism, LGBT, drag queen story, it's just a passing phase. It won't get any worse. It'll soon end. But it didn't. It got worse. And we're the ones here dealing with it. And in a sense, the Queen can be held more responsible than the boomers, because she actually had the power. I mean, my mum, she couldn't have done anything. She was a secretary, but the Queen had the power. But the thing is that the Queen went further than a lot of normie boomers, and this is where I really come in to criticism of her. Now, I'd say to all of you, if you're pro-Queen, if you're in the movement and you're pro-Queen, type into YouTube Queen's speech, Christmas Day 2004. You watch that, and you tell me after you've watched that if you're still pro the Queen. Because in that speech, because the BNP had started to grow around that time, someone had said to her, use your Queen speech to support the multiculturalism that's coming in. So she went beyond being like a normie boomer, like my mum, someone who just looks the other way and ignores, thinks it's just a minor little thing. And she actively collaborated with the multiculturalism, with the cultural Marxism. Now, one of the stories the Queen used in that Queen speech, one of the examples, she said, oh, I recently had a friend, and she said to me, oh, the best part of my recent holiday to London was the tube from Heathrow. And then the Queen said, well, how so? And then this friend of the Queen said, oh, it was so lovely seeing all these different school children of all different colours coming on the tube and being friends, and this multicultural rainbow heaven that I saw. And this was the story. And the fact is, it wasn't even genuine, because I remembered that story had been told on Question Time by a Liberal panellist a few months before. So the Queen, it wasn't a friend of hers who told her that story. She'd taken it off a Liberal panellist on Question Time. So not only was it a load of nonsense, it was also an apocryphal story doing the rounds in the Liberal elite that no, her friend didn't tell her. She'd taken it off a left-wing fanatic on Question Time recycled it and put it out to millions more people. Now, back in the day then, I used to read Right Now magazine. Now, one of the people who I knew through Conservative Democratic Alliance and later Traditional Britain, who used to write in Derek Turner's Right Now magazine, was Stuart Milson. And he actually said, when he saw that speech in Right Now magazine, I think he wrote, that after that Queen's speech of Christmas Day 2004, something died in me. And he didn't feel the same about the Queen. And I remember I was watching it, I think, and my mate Alex here, I think he was at our house, and he said, I could see you just getting so angry. And this is because this is the point where I realised she wasn't just pretending not to notice for a quiet life. She wasn't just looking the other way. She was actively collaborating with the destruction of our nation. And I obviously, this was the first time she'd done it out in the open. But thanks to Dr. Dutton's programme last Monday, I know she'd been doing it before. And there were two interventions in the 1980s and one in 79. No, 179, 187. And these two interventions show that Queen, she cared more about her Commonwealth subjects than she ever did. These working class ancestors of mine, you know, Uncle Les, Auntie Jack, Nanny Grandpop, they viewed the Queen as part of their identity, part of their patriotism, but she never cared about them. She cared far more about her Commonwealth and that title. And the first intervention, this is thanks to Dr. Dutton. I don't take credit where I didn't find something out. I credit the other creator. The first one was 1979. Margaret Thatcher. Now, Thatcher wasn't woke on race, but she wasn't someone who went to the other extent and did what the Liberals wanted. She tended to if people wanted to be right-wing or racial separatist in their country, she tended to let them get on with it. Now, in 1979, Thatcher, she didn't want to recognise the Zimbabwe of Robert Mugabe because his government was communist. And the Queen, because of her love for the Commonwealth, she pressured her to do so. So the Queen, she eased Rhodesia and its transition into Zimbabwe. So a nation that was the richest in Africa went to be in a basket case where there's hyperinflation and, you know, black people starve because they can't get a loaf of bread. And in 1976, in Rhodesia, there were 270,000 white people. Today, there's less than 20,000. I mean, there's one guy on this island, and he helped me get some of my documents when I come. Guy, and he was originally from Rhodesia, and he ended up here. Now, the second intervention she made was in 1987. And again, Thatcher, she did not want sanctions to her credit on South Africa. And the Queen pressured her to do so. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say apartheid South Africa was perfect, but in a lot of ways it was a damn sight better than the South Africa of today. Now, obviously there was injustices, but this idea that for every black person under apartheid South Africa, every single day was a living hell, well, that's utter nonsense. I mean, first of all, today you've got black people killing black people of other tribes in the street. You've got a crime endemic. You have to pay bribes. You've got poverty, starvation. Now, under apartheid, the African black may not have had a vote. He may have had to live in a certain area, but he had food, he had job security, he wasn't going to starve to death, he had law and order, he didn't have to pay a bribe to do something in the bureaucracy. Now, and also, in terms of the black middle class, I've actually read about this. There were black middle class shop owners who had shops in the black townships, and when apartheid ended, all the blacks in the townships went to the multinational companies in the white shopping mall and the multinational supermarkets. So there was a whole raft of middle class black shop owners who went from being prosperous because everyone in the black township shopped with the black shop owner to being poor because all the blacks in the township went to the multinational company in the white shopping mall. So this idea that apartheid South Africa was just, one long hell for black people, it wasn't perfect. And, segregated societies, they're probably not the best model because they don't last long term, don't seem to. But it wasn't the hell that it's been made out today. And the Queen, by working against apartheid South Africa, again, she's selling out her own people of British descent, but the Boers, for black people. So again, it's her not caring about her own people. And I mean, what can you say? It's that was the two interventions, Rhodesia and South Africa. So there was no intervention or attempt to intervene to stop war criminal Blair attacking Serbia in 1999. So terrorists in a province could forcefully leave the nation. I mean, it's like, suppose Catalonia wanted to leave Spain. It's like bombing. What Blair did was like bombing Madrid. If Spain says because I don't know how many of you know, it's been in the news. Catalonia held an illegal referendum to try and leave Spain, and the Spanish government in Madrid said no, and it imprisoned a lot of the Catalonian leaders who held that referendum, and they've since been pardoned and let out, but they wouldn't allow the referendum. Now, that was more or less the situation Serbia had with Kosovo. It had people in Kosovo, Muslims, wanted to leave illegally, break away, and Blair, the war criminal, starts bombing Belgrade. So it's the same symptom of when Madrid says to Catalonia, you can't have a referendum. It's like Blair sending planes over here to bomb Madrid. Utterly insane. And obviously Blair's other crime was the Iraq War that, killed 100,000 Iraqis, 160 British soldiers and thousands of Americans. And again, Queen, no intervention, and not only that, she even knighted the man and let him on the Privy Council. And so, this is, another thing, David Cameron, you had gay marriage, gay adoptions. Again, did the Queen, a supposed, committed Christian, did she say anything? Did she intervene? No. You had the Equality Act 2010, which is, it's as far, it's almost a destruction, attack on ancient liberties. And, because the Equality Act 2010 says a hate incident is an incident defined as hate by the victim or any other person. So it means any crime where a black person is a victim, a gay person is a victim, they can straight away say it's hate. And even if they don't say it's hate, someone nearby can say it's hate. And even when we go further back, Edward Heath sacked Enoch Powell. Again, did the Queen try and prevent this, try and stand up against this? No, silence again. And Prince Charles is probably going to be even worse because he's already thrown his oar in over the sensible Rwanda plan and said the plan to send immigrants to Rwanda is immoral. Now, another thing Dutton said, it's there in the national anthem, one of the lines, God save our gracious Queen, may she defend our laws. And again, she's failed. Ever since the Norman conquest, there has been a law of double jeopardy, so that you cannot be tried twice for the same crime. Now, the Labour government, they got rid of this in 2003. And they got rid of this because of Stephen Lawrence. And they had an obsession with getting a conviction on that case. Now, I mean, the first thing is, you look at the Stephen Lawrence case, there were two bugging operations. There was a period in 1995 where the suspects were bugged for months on end near flat, never mentioned the murder, never even referred to it, you know, vaguely or inadvertently, never mentioned the incident. Then there was another bugging operation after the Lawrence suspects did that interview with Martin Bashir. They were given a free holiday in a house up in Scotland, and again the government had the whole thing bugged, and the bugging tapes were sent down via nuclear submarine, and the state threw tons of resources at this operation, and these guys were bugged for months on end. Now the Daily Mail, which called them murderers, the Daily Mail said they were really thick, really uneducated bigots. Yet these guys are bugged for months on end, and they never slipped up once. Now you get mafia bosses who control £1 million empires. They get bugged. Sooner or later, they slip up. I mean, my own situation, I mean, you don't know if you've watched my other videos, I was sacked from the police because outside of work, under a false name, I had a Facebook account where I criticised gay pride parades, police joining in those as narcissistic attention seeking, and said the taxpayer shouldn't fund virtue signalling. And I clicked like on the right-wing patriotic group Traditional Britain, and that was enough to see me suspended for a year on full pay, then sacked from the Met Police. So, I mean, I got an A and 2 A levels, A and 2 Bs in my A levels, and I got caught out. I was able to keep my mouth shut at work, and when idiots like Charlie Charles would give me lectures on political correctness, I kept my mouth shut, never said a word. But outside work, I slipped up and I said something, so I got caught. So these 5 thick, uneducated bigots, they must be smarter than me, because I slipped up and said something right wing, and I've never murdered anyone, and the fact is they'd apparently murdered someone and they never said a word about it. So either they're either super intelligent, or maybe even they didn't do it. You never know. I mean, I think 2 of them were later convicted in 2012 on DNA evidence, but the state was so desperate to get those guys, or at least some of them, that I wouldn't even put it past the state to fabricate the evidence. I mean, the whole resources of the state were thrown against this. Now, the fact is, the Queen rubber stamped this, and the double jeopardy law was got rid of. Now, obviously, when someone is murdered and the suspect isn't caught, it is a tragedy, whoever they are. But the fact is, from what you got from the Daily Mail and all the Liberal elite, it was like Stephen Lawrence was the only person ever to be murdered without the suspect getting caught. And obviously that is utter nonsense. Now, I can say, as someone who was in the Met, occasionally someone will be murdered and unfortunately the suspect will not be caught. And we all know of the case of, I think it was Daniel Morgan, the private detectives in the 80s. And he was killed in a pub car park with an axe through the back of his head, and they never found who did it. And they had people who were quite strong suspects, but they never found who did it. Now, all the Met Police can do is 5 or 10 years on, they can have a review of the evidence. A fresh set of eyes will look at the evidence and see if there's anything there. But the idea that you put someone on trial twice, I mean, they shouldn't go to trial the first time if there's not enough evidence. And I mean, I can quote from a murder that I was aware of. I was no part of investigating this or anything like that, so I don't know the inside story. I was sent down to this arcade under near Charing Cross Station, and there was loads of homeless people who used to hang out down there, and the shop owners were getting really fed up with it because they didn't want all these homeless people taking drugs down there, and people were scared to go down there. So they sent me and this other guy down there, and it was quite intimidating because they all started shouting at us and all the rest of it. And I was thinking, oh God, it's really going to kick off here. And one of the most intimidating ones was this really big mixed race fella, and he'd shout at you, and his hands would be up like that as he shouted at you. And a lot of the stuff it was all this bizarre stuff he would say, and it was sort of like stuff about God, and he used to refer to himself, and other people have referred to him as the preacher of the homeless. And I realised after a while he'd shout, and because he was so big, he looked quite intimidating, but he wasn't actually really objectionable or really threatening. He wasn't a nasty piece of work who'd attack you for no reason. But obviously, because of his size, people were intimidated by him. When he started putting his hands up and doing his preaching and shouting. Now, what happened a few months after this, he was in an argument with some other homeless people, and he, doing his usual thing, preacher to the homeless, he had his arms up like this, and doing all that with his shouting, and because of his size, the guy or the people who he was arguing with were obviously scared and intimidated, and I don't know, the argument spiraled out of control, and where he'd raised his hand, he was stabbed under there, and he died, sadly. Now, obviously, the other two homeless, I think it was two homeless who'd done this, they were arrested and sent in prison. But there was no CCTV, I don't think, and there was one witness, and the only witness was another drug addict homeless woman. Now, obviously, in terms of witnesses, a woman who spends half her week off her head on drugs isn't the greatest asset in terms of being a good witness. So what happened, these two guys, I think it was two, it might have been one, I think it was two, they did about 3 months on remand, and then this witness, she failed to turn up on the appointed day at court because she was off her head on drugs, and they were acquitted. So that's this guy, and he was. And he wasn't white, he was mixed race, and I never saw it in the newspapers once. And I said to another officer, I said, you hear all this about Stephen Lawrence as if that's the only murder that wasn't solved, yet here's this guy, and because he was homeless, because his family had probably disowned him or he'd grown up in care, and people don't notice him, because he didn't have a dad who worked for the editor of the Daily Mail painting his spare room, so the editor of the Daily Mail heard about it, and so he's just forgotten. But I said he was still murdered, and they got away with it. So this idea that Stephen Lawrence is the only the only person who was black who's been murdered and it's not been solved is utter nonsense. And also, this idea that it was institutional racism. I mean, I'm a white nationalist, and if I'd have been investigating that homeless preacher's death, I'd have done it exactly the same as any other person, obviously. But occasionally, the way things are, you'll have an unreliable witness, you'll have no CCTV, you'll have no forensics because it was raining or whatever, and someone will get away with murder. And it's a tragedy, and it's not good. But the moment you start saying, we're going to get rid of all the protections, like the double jeopardy law, then you're opening the door to innocent men spending 20 odd years in jail for crimes they didn't commit. So again, there's the line in the national anthem, may she defend our laws, and because of one murder that was politicised, that as I've made clear was one of many that weren't solved. I mean, I've just given two other examples of murders where sadly, like with Stephen Lawrence, the suspect wasn't caught. Well, there's no, not all the suspects were caught and jailed, and the law wasn't changed for them. And the Queen, as head of state, that was her chance to say, yes, it's a tragedy if someone is murdered, but my duty as monarch, may she defend our laws. I'm not going to have laws that have stood to protect English liberties since the Norman Conquest abolished because of political correctness. But she failed to do it. So now we've looked at all the stuff she's done wrong. Let's look at the other side of it. We'll give her a chance. Now, there is a downside to being in the royal family. Now, I'll tell you about when I was a student. Is a little story from when I was a student. I was a student at Exeter University where I did a 2-1 in history politics. Then I applied for the Royal Navy as an officer, but I was sadly turned down because I wasn't ever any good at maths or psychometrics tests. And then not knowing what to do, I went to Sussex University and I did a master's degree in early modern history where I did a dissertation on the gunpowder plot. And when I was at Sussex University for a year in 2002, I lived in Lewes, and it's a nice little village. And there was a pub I used to go to called the King's Head in Lewes. And some evenings I'd go there and I'd eat dinner, have a glass of red wine and read my Telegraph. And I didn't know a lot of people there, so I didn't go up and chat to all the locals in the bar, but sometimes I'd just observe and listen to the conversations, because this was the days before sort of YouTube and Wi-Fi where you could listen to a podcast while you're in the pub if you're on your own. So I was sat there in the pub this night, and as I've said to you before on here, as a student, it's the only time in my life I've been lonely and unhappy, and I'd say to youngsters, unless you want to be a lawyer or a doctor, I'd say don't go to university, because it was quite an unhappy time in my life, and I was much happier once I was working. You have more sort of regiment and purpose to your day, and you've got money. And so I was in this pub in Lewes this night in 2002 as a sort of unhappy, poverty-stricken student. And there's this guy at the bar, and he's sat there in his overalls. And then they start talking about the royal family. And then this guy, he sits back in his overalls with paint, so I assume he's some sort of decorator or painter. And he suddenly says, I'm a happy bunny. I like my life. And he stretched back and he sat back like that, and then he took a little sip of his beer. And he said, I'd hate being in the royal family. He said, I'd much rather be a decorator. He said, I do my work, I come and sit here, No one bothers me. He said, if I was in the royal family, wherever I'd go, I'd have people hassling me. I couldn't go where I like. I couldn't do what I like when I like. He said, when I'm not at work, I can do what I like when I like. They can't. And this is the downside of being a royal. And this is that man in that pub in Lewes in 2002, that decorator. He'd rather be a decorator because he had that freedom. And the Queen and Prince Charles, they might have 3 palaces to his semi-detached house, but he can get up Saturday morning, he can go wherever he likes, he can do whatever he likes, he can say whatever he likes, unless he's inciting or, within reason, and he's got that freedom, and they haven't got that. And I think the only night that the Queen was a free, normal person like you and me, who are on this channel, the only night she was free, I think the night of VE Day, her and her sister, because they weren't so recognisable then, they went out into the crowds without any bodyguards, and that was one night where the Queen was a normal person, where she was out in the crowd with her sister on the night of VE Day, and she was just a normal person like you and me, wandering around doing what she liked. Now, you've got to give her credit that she was able to maintain that professional front at all times for 70 years. Now, you think, you, my viewers, and me, supposing we're out one day on the street and we see someone we know, but for whatever reason, we're not in a mood to talk, we're not in a good mood, and we don't fancy a chat. So we can slip away down a side alley, or if they do see us, we just wave and say, look, all right, mate, I'm not in a mood, I'm in a rush, I'm on my way somewhere. Now, the thing is, she can't do that. That's the one thing that we've got over the rules. We can go out and be in a bad mood and not have to talk to anyone. Or if we do see someone, we can say, oh, I'm just on my way somewhere, and give an excuse. Now, the thing is, she can't do that. Obviously, she can't slip away down a side street because everyone's looking at her. Everyone knows who she is. And also, there's the fact that she won't remember meeting that person, but she knows that person will remember the day they met her for the rest of their lives. So she knows if she's standoffish or nasty to them, that person for the rest of their life, they're going to be going about saying, oh, I met the Queen and she was a complete bitch to me. And they're going to be going out the rest of their life to everyone they know. So she has to have that act of politeness. And you've got to give her credit. She kept up that professional front for 70 odd years. And we've seen Prince Charles, he's already lost his temper in week 1 with a pen. And when did we ever see the Queen lose her temper? So, you've got to give it to her that she did have that professionalism. And that's one thing on her plus side, that she was able to maintain that professional front. Because the thing is, if you're a prominent person and you don't have that ability to glad hand, that ability to be charming, you tend to get a reputation as difficult. And here's someone who we'll all love, all of us in the movement. Good old, brilliant biography by Simon Heffer, Enoch Powell. Now, he was primarily an intellectual who cared about the issues. So he didn't have all the glad handling. That, that side, there's probably part of the reason why he didn't get to the very top of politics. He didn't have that schmoozing ability that Boris Johnson or Clinton have. He could be abrupt, not necessarily because he wanted to upset people or annoy people, but he just didn't have that charm. He was maybe slightly autistic. And there's a good story in here. I mean, it's 20 years since I read this, so I won't remember a lot of it, but there's a good story. Margaret Thatcher met Enoch at his 81st birthday party, and she come up to him and she said, "Oh, Enoch, I've not seen you since I attended your 80th birthday party. How are you then?" She was all smiling. He goes, "I'm 81." And that was it. and it's not exactly the sort of schmoozing, charming reply, is it? And the thing is, I did hear stories like that, and even though Enoch is a hero to us in the movement, I actually asked my friend Sam Swirling, who I've known for years through Conservative Democratic Alliance and Traditional Britain. He was a parliamentary candidate in the 70s, and I think Enoch came and campaigned for him. And I said to him, I said, "I've heard stories about Enoch being difficult." And I said, what was he like as a person to get along with? Was he hard to get on with? And he said, no. He said, once you knew him, he was totally charming, totally polite. He didn't make an attempt to schmooze up to people, but he was totally polite and totally charming. So this reputation Enoch had for being difficult, it was perhaps a little unfair, because he couldn't be bothered with the bullshit as a very intelligent person. Now, someone like Bill Clinton, he had all that charm. Bill Clinton could go to a party and he'd go around shaking hands, and he'd not only remember the person's name who he was talking to, he'd remember their parents' name and say, "Oh, how's your mother, Sarah," or whatever. But the thing is, with Clinton, it was all false. And the fact is, Enoch probably actually gave a damn more about the people, his constituents, his supporters, than Clinton ever did. But Clinton had the charm, but it was there was nothing underneath it. And so it's unfair a bit, but that is the game of politics. And you've got to give the Queen praise for that she had that charm, that smoothing ability to converse with strangers and always be charming with strangers. And part of why Boris Johnson rose as high as he did was because of that charm he had. And I met him one time. And this was I think it was about 2009-8 when he was the London mayor. And I'd always rather go to right-wing meetings, UKIP, BNP, CDA, Traditional Britain. I didn't really have interest in attending Tory events by this time. But I had a Russian girl I was friends with, Hannah Moulton, and she liked going to them. So occasionally I'd go along with her as a friend, save her having to go on her own. And Boris Johnson, when he was Mayor of London, he came up to my friend Hannah, and he's giving it all the schmoozing, because I think she was quite pretty when she was younger, and he's talking a bit of Russian to her. And then he'd been on that programme, Meet the Ancestors, and he'd said about having an ancestor in Turkey assassinated. So when he looked at me, I said to him, "I saw you on that programme, Meet the Ancestors." I said, "You said about having an ancestor assassinated. Who assassinated him?" And he said, "Oh, it was a supporter of Ataturk, because he supported the Sultan." Now, the funny thing is, when I asked him that question, there was a second before he answered it. He just looked me up and down, and all this sort of Billy Bunter posh boy charm, he just switched it off, because he could see I wasn't interested in it. I wasn't really that amused or overawed by it. He just turned it off like a switch. And Hannah was giggling like a little girl when he did all his bit of Russian. But when he spoke to me, he looked me up and down like that, and he could see I didn't give a shit about all the posh boy charm. I might think he's mildly amusing on Have I Got News for You, but it wasn't going to be overawed by it. And so he just switched it off. So in a sense, the politicians like Clinton, like Boris Johnson, who have all this schmoozing, they're probably not as nice people as they are as Enoch Powell, but because they have all this schmoozing, all this front and charisma and pretend caring, virtue signalling, they get the reputation that they're a nicer person when in reality they probably aren't. But it's what works in politics, and is one of the things you've got to give the Queen credit for. So in the plus side of the column, she's got the fact that she was always able to put on the front and be professional and be charming. But I mean, you could say that about a postman at work, a policeman at work, a dustman at work. If someone's rude to them, they can't just start swearing back. They've got to be professional because they're at work. And then you say to me, oh, well, the Queen, she's at work 24/7. Yeah, that is harder because like the decorator in Lewis says, she doesn't have that freedom. But on the plus side, you get 3 palaces and a ton of servants. So, and you never ever have money worries. So it's not all in the deficit column. In return for that being on duty, having to put on that front 24 hours a day, you get 3 palaces, no money worries ever, and numerous servants. Now, Mark, he said in the movement, he actually pointed this out, that she had done her duty for 70 years. So all this stuff that I've pointed out in the stuff that she did wrong, it's going to mean something to us. But your average normie, when I say 1987 sanctions about South Africa, it's not going to hit home. So when Mark was saying that we should respect the fact that she's done her duty, I think he's probably got the right approach here. Because, I mean, the Queen, she's a hard person to hate. She's like a lot of normies. You're not going to be inspired by her. You're not going to think, oh, she's brilliant. She's an inspirational leader. I'll follow to the end of the earth. But at the same time, you're not going to be, oh, I hate her. You know, because she's not like a left-wing activist. And obviously, I've said in my previous video, for us in the movement to triumph, what we've ultimately got to do, whether it's election, whether it's civil war, whatever, we've got to win more people to our side than the left and the Liberals can. So we can't go down the line of purist, oh, here's my list of the things the Queen did wrong. Here's my list of her collaboration. Therefore, we should line her up and shoot her. If we start going down that route, it's ridiculous, because as it says in the Daily Mail, and for a lot of older people, like my dead relatives, the Queen is tied up with the sense of patriotism, with the sense of Britishness. And if you go down this purist route, you really do, you get to a tinier and tinier group of people that you're talking to and you're appealing to and that connect with you. So I think Mark has come up with the right approach here. Us in the movement, we've got to say, Mark and Laura, they're the biggest leaders in the right at the moment. So got to give them credit for that. Whatever bitter Nick Griffin is saying on the sidelines because he can't accept his day in the sun is over. The pragmatic thing to do is say, yes, she did her duty. Yes, we respect her for that. And if the conversation gets really deep, then we can say, look, she failed to do this, this and this. But on a surface level, if it's a brief thing, yeah, we respect her, she did her duty. And people who go down the pure route, they just become almost ridiculous. And we've all heard, I think, that Nazi LARPer guy in Australia, I think it's Thomas Sewell or whoever he is, and he was on Chris Mitchell's stream, and he was talking about his granddad in World War II, and this Thomas, his granddad went and bombed German cities in World War II as a bomber pilot. And then this Thomas, then he said on Chris Mitchell's podcast, he said, my granddad's a war criminal. He should be put on trial for war crimes. And you're like, seriously, mate, you really reckon you're going to sell this? Now, I've said in my other videos, you can make a good case that Britain should remain neutral in World War One and World War Two. But to then go to the extent where you're asking people to go and say, oh, my granddad, because my granddad was in Bomber Command in World War Two, oh, my granddad was a war criminal and I want to put him on trial. You just look ridiculous. And normies turn their backs on you by the mile. And the left, they'll put someone like that to prominence because he looks so crazy, going so hardcore, that it just turns people off. So Mark's approach here is the right one in terms of, let's respect her for doing her duty. And if the conversation gets deeper, then we can point out this is where she failed us. Now, obviously, I was a policeman in Westminster, and so people say to me here, they say, did you ever see the Queen? Well, we used to do guard change in the morning. I think it was guard change 3 days a week. And you had to stand for 3 hours a day. No, you had to stand for 2 hours in guard change. But it was good because you got an early finish on the early shift. The sort of 7 till 3 shift. They might let you go home at 1:30. Now, I think the only other time I met a major royal was Prince Charles at the Savoy. I was on an aid and he was coming to an event there, and I was the police officer who was stood by the door, the uniformed officer who stood by the door as he went in. And before he arrived, his bodyguard came, because I think he had 2 Range Rovers. He had bodyguards who went ahead and checked beforehand, and bodyguards, close protection, who stayed with him. And the ones who went ahead, they come up to me and spoke to me and said, Prince Charles is coming. Then they said to me, oh, could you stand a little bit away from the entrance door, because he doesn't like to see a lot of uniformed police around him. I thought, oh, that's nice. I thought, you're there doing your job, protecting the bloody bloke, and he doesn't want to see you. He doesn't want to see you. And you're like, oh god, great. Yeah, but that was his attitude. Now, I did know a guy when I was on Impact Team. I can't even remember his name, but he was ex-military, and he was in palaces. Now, the royal family, what they have the close protection officers. They're the ones who protect VIPs, and they're in plain clothes. They're in a suit. They have a gun and a taser, and the suit is specially tailored to hide the gun and the taser. But what they also have is palaces, and this will be officers who have guns who will guard the palaces where they are, and they will meet the royals occasionally when the royals are at the palace that they are guarding. And you will see them, if you go to Buckingham Palace, you will see them standing there outside the palace holding their machine gun. And I knew someone, this old guy who was ex-military, who had been in that. And see, there's 2 groups. There's palaces who protect palaces, and there's diplomatic protection group who protect the embassies. And they were also based in Charing Cross, and they were in a separate building within Charing Cross. I think it was called Apex House. and they're called Diplomatic Protection Group, and they do the embassies, and that is the group that the notorious Wayne Couzens was in, and you'd occasionally see them in the yard at Charing Cross, but if you were just normal, average Westminster Borough Police, but you wouldn't go in their building because that was for them. So it's possible that I walked past Wayne Couzens in the yard at Charing Cross Police Station, but I don't have any memory of him. And all this nonsense that he was called the rapist when he was in police as his nickname, well, word went about pretty quickly about people in the police, and yeah, I never heard that nickname, and I don't think any other people I knew heard it. So you obviously, this guy knew he was in the Palaces group, who was ex-military, and when I was on Impact Zone in Leicester Square, I talked to him, and he told me he met Prince Andrew when he was in the forces, and he was really nice and really friendly. But then he met him again in the police when he was on Palaces, and he was an arrogant twat. So Prince Andrew, I think he tends to be one of these who's nice to military, but the poor police who are guarding him, many of whom are ex-military, he's not so polite to. Now this guy, this old guy who'd been in the forces in Palaces, he was very much one of these. He liked to go to the pub after work. Yeah, on Impact Zone we'd have four 12-hour days, then we'd have 4 or 5 days off, then we'd do 4 nights in a row, and he was one of these. On the last night of the days, he'd like to always go to the pub and shoot the shit, and I was, because of the way things are and my private views, I'd always avoid socialising with work colleagues when I was in the police. But he was very much, he was like, come to the pub, come to the pub. And to give him credit, when I did go with it, because a lot of the young people in the Met, they're PC fanatics. And because he was ex-forces, he liked to go out for a drink after work. And I almost wanted to say to him, look, it's not like it was in the 80s and the 90s in the military. If someone says something in the pub that's not PC now, they're probably, the way these youngsters are that are in the new joiners, they'll probably be writing an MG11 to DPS, Department of Professional Standards, the very next day. Now, when we were in the pub, he told me about when he was in Palaces, and to give him credit, the guys he brought along to the pub were decent guys, had a good laugh, good drink with them. And he said, oh, the Queen was quite sharp, he said to me. He said, when she'd met me 3 or 4 times, she remembered me. And I think in a way, again, this is part of her skills of socialising and schmoozing with people. And my objection to this is, it doesn't mean she was clever, because someone can be good at one particular task, but they're not. It doesn't mean they're very clever generally. I mean, I remember when I was a postman, before you'd go out on delivery, you'd throw in your round in a frame. And there was this guy in Biggin Hill office called Lazar. He's Nick Lazarus, but we'd all call him Lazar. And he was not being nasty, because not everyone can be super intelligent. I'm only average intelligence myself. He wasn't very clever, but all he seemed to know about was football. All he seemed to read was The Sun. But in terms of throwing in his round, he was amazing. No one could beat him. He had a massive round with loads of post, and he'd get it thrown in about 20 minutes, half hour. And other people, they'd be lagging 20 minutes, 15 minutes behind him. And so you get someone who's good at one specific skill, like Lazar at throwing in his round, like the Queen at doing small talk and remembering people in social situations, but it doesn't mean that they're generally clever. And this is where we get to the cause of why the Queen has always just been a normie. And I think my case would be that the Queen has always been a normie because she's not really that clever. And there's a great bit in Alan Clark's diaries, and it's when he goes to his Privy Council ceremony, and then he says here, he goes, "Not for the first time I wondered about the Queen. Is she really rather dull and stupid?" And there's this thing. See, the Queen has always had all this praise. Oh, she never gives her opinion. She's so professional. She never gives her opinion. She never says anything politically controversial. And she's got all this massive praise, as if it's some Herculean effort that she's got all these convictions and all these opinions, and she's just biting her tongue and never letting forth on what she'd like to say. But it might not be that. It might just be she's not very clever, she's not very clued up on the issues, and so she doesn't really take an interest in things that are happening, so she hasn't got a really strong opinion. And a lot of this would a lot of what would bear this out is the family generally. Now, there was a book, I had it on my Kindle. There was a book on the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Edward VIII, their exile. And in this book, the Duke of Windsor, he once admitted to a woman at a party, he said, "I've got a low IQ, you know." And this woman at the party, she tried to be nice. She said, "Yes, but Your Majesty, you wrote a book." And he's like, "No, that was ghostwritten." And then another time, Churchill sent the Duke of Windsor his memoirs, and the Duke just put it up on the shelf with his other like 5 or 10 books. And then he remarked to a servant, he said, "Oh, I'm not much of a reader." And when you look at the life he led in exile with the Duchess of Windsor, it was just very much, he'd play golf in the morning and then they'd have a dinner party in the evening. And there didn't seem to be any sort of great, interests or passions for anything. And you could also look at Prince Harry for this. Now, Prince Harry, he went to one of the best schools in England, Eton. Now, I think at Eton, he'd have got brilliant, top of the range teaching, the best teaching you can get. He'd have had, help with anything he found trouble with. Now, he went to Eton, and I think if I'm right on this, I think he got 2 A levels, and I think he got a C and a D. Now, let's face it, now I went to Orpington College. I mean, not boasting, I got an A and 2 Bs. Now, there's a lot of people smarter than me, but I would wager that I'm probably a little bit smarter than a lot of the people in the royal family, because if you can go to a school like that and not do the normal 3 A levels, do 2 A levels, and not get an A or a B in any of them. Now, you think, had Prince Harry been on a council estate, born on a council estate, he'd have probably got maybe 1 GCSE. So he had all this tons of help in his education, and all he got was a C and D at A level. And this is perhaps why Meghan has been able to, manipulate him and control him and turn him into a sort of woke ginger puppet. Now, Dr. Dutton, in his videos, he says IQ is about 0.7% heritable. Now, I mean, I'm open about my IQ. Whenever I've done it on the little tests on the ISNEC books, it comes out between 105 and 110. So I'm not super smart, but I'm not super thick either. I'm about average. But I would assume that the royal family, you're maybe looking at below average, because you know they're getting top level educations, and they don't seem to have much interest in reading or musical instruments. I mean, I play the piano, I learn Spanish, I read books, and people who are down the lower end of the scale, they don't tend to have this many interests. And seeing a lot of these middle class liberals, they say to right wingers that we're thick, and that's a constant thing you get from them, and they'll say, oh, we're thick. But the fact is, everyone in our movement, they take the time to find out about things. They take the time to discover facts so they can make arguments. They take the time to find out what's going on. They take the time to find out our history, and to want to do all that and find all that out about what's really going on in the history and formulate the right-wing arguments. You've got to have a certain level of intelligence. And maybe the Queen, she never acted or did anything out of conviction because she didn't have any convictions, because she just was never that intelligent to go and look at the facts and what's going on. And I mean, obviously she was aware of the news. She'd know what was going on, but would she look at what's going on behind the news and say Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And would the Queen have thought, oh, I agree with it's wrong, but Putin was provoked here, here, and here, and see my video on that? Would she take an issue like that and look at it and examine it, and then come up with a strong opinion so she could do a video like I did on it? And the answer probably is no. So all this massive praise that she got for going 70 years and never saying anything controversial, perhaps it wasn't a Herculean effort to not give her opinion from all her massive reading and her massive, finding out. Perhaps it was she wasn't that clever, so she hadn't done a lot of reading. So below the surface level, she wasn't really that clued up to what's going on. So she didn't have these convictions and these thoughts on things. So maybe this praise she always gets is undeserved. Now, my favourite king is Charles Ist. And I'll show you these. These are brilliant books. C.V. Wedgwood, she wrote The King's War, and the prequel to that is The King's Peace, and then there's The Trial of Charles I. Now, I would say, I mean, these books, they're really well written. They're like novels. The way C.V. Wedgwood, she was like Runciman on the Crusades. These books are written like novels. They're absolutely, they're real page turners. And if you want to find out about the English Civil War, I'd say to you, my friends, read C.V. Wedgwood's trilogy, and you will find all you want to know. And the thing about Charles I, he wasn't perfect. And as a young man, he was addicted to hunting. Now, there was another book I read about him by Charles Carlton, and it relates the story as how when Charles I was a young man, he fell into a bog. Now, I mean, I've never done hunting, but I've been out. When I was in England, I used to be in Holland Angling Club in Hurst Green near Oxted, and I'd go fishing. Now, if I'd been out fishing and I'd fallen in a bog, I'd go home. But Charles I, he was such a hunting fanatic. A servant gave him some fresh clothes and he carried on with the hunt. And he didn't do, when he was a young man, the paperwork day in, day out. He didn't have the disciplined approach to kingship that that you really need. So he can be criticised for that. And also, you could say he was a little dogmatic and unrealistic. I mean, Charles I, he believed in the divine right of kings. He said on the scaffold, a subject and a sovereign are clear and different things. He had his own view of religion and the High Church Anglicanism that him and Archbishop Laud believed in, and they wanted to impose that on England as a whole. And that was perhaps a little dogmatic and unrealistic. Now, I won't get too far into theology because then I'll get a load of comments off my friend Claire Core, who is a little bit obsessive about theology, and she'll start having theological arguments with me. But Charles I, you can say he was a bit too dogmatic and a bit too unrealistic. He wanted his High Church Anglicanism, he wanted his divine right of kings. Now, after the First Civil War ended, he was taken prisoner by the Scots, and then they sold him to Parliament. Now, this was in 1646-47. In 1647, he could have made a deal and been like a puppet king and kept his life going. But he didn't compromise. He fought on with his principles, and the Second Civil War broke out. And that's when Parliament decided to chop his head off. Now, one thing you can say about Charles I, he might have been dogmatic, he might have been unrealistic with his divine right of kings, he might have been stubborn, inflexible, not cared enough about politics. But one thing you cannot criticise him for is lack of conviction and lack of bravery. And Charles went all the way to the scaffold, and he was on that scaffold clinging to his convictions. Now, if Charles had been placed on the throne in 1953, would he have sat silent as all the things that made Britain great, traditionalism, homogeneity, Christian values, the traditional family, all these things, piece by piece, were demolished? Would Charles I, a man of principle, have sat silent and said nothing? And I'd say no. And so when you get down to it, what have we got with Elizabeth? We've got longevity. She lived a long time, till 96, and you've got she did her duty. Well, everyone does their duty at work, and yes, she had to do it 24 hours a day, but she had 3 palaces and no money worries in exchange. So when you look at it, Charles I, he only reigned for 24 years, but he was greater because he had principle. He had things he believed in. He had things he would stand for, even at the extent of losing his life. And so this is why Charles I is remembered today, and the scene of him on the scaffold saying, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown." That's why that's remembered, because he made a stand. He stood up for principle. And with Elizabeth, when people look back in hundreds of years, will there be anything like that to inspire them? And the sad answer is no. All we've got is longevity and doing the job for a long time. We've got no conviction. We've got no making a stand on the issues. We've got the only 2 interventions she did make were on behalf of Africans, not British people. So in a sense, she was just a normie, just the most famous normie, and that's all we're left with. And that's all I've got to say on it. So in a sense, Charles I was greater. And when people look back in hundreds of years with Elizabeth, all we've got is the longevity. And that's why I say for none of us in the movement, she can be a hero. So I thank you for your time. I think I've maybe gone around the houses and waffled a little bit on this, but I wanted to talk on this because I think really Queen Elizabeth was just the biggest normie. Thank you. Good night.